Welcome back to my Puppetmaster review series. Today I'm doing number 2. This one came out in 1990 and was directed by David Allen, a different guy from the one who did the first movie. Before we get into it, let me just say that this is the only Puppetmaster film I had previously seen before I started these reviews, but it was a long, long time ago that I saw it, way back in the middle of the 90s, back in the era of video rental stores. So when I popped in my disc to watch this the other night, I felt a great sense of nostalgia, over a quarter of a century since I saw this movie. And I only really remembered a couple of the kills. I certainly didn't remember what was going to happen from scene to scene as I was going through it. So this is, storyline-wise, a continuation of the first movie, but it's also sort of a semi-reset. I mean, we're still at the Boyega Hotel. The location hasn't changed, but none of the characters from the first movie return. Now, in the case of Alex Whittaker, I'm not particularly surprised because he leaves the hotel at the end of the first movie and there's no reason for him to go back there. But in the case of Megan, the hotel owner, I'm certainly surprised that she doesn't come back, because there's a scene right at the end of the first Puppetmaster where she seems to have mastered Toulon's magic. So if I was going to guess what the plot of Puppetmaster 2 would be, I would have said that she would become the new Puppet Master, but no, they've decided to kill her off between 1 and 2. Maybe she did try and become the new Puppet Master and the puppets just didn't take to it, because apparently she gets murdered by then before the second film starts. So they've done to her what they did to the Shaw character between Prometheus and Alien Covenant in the Alien franchise. Now, the fact that Megan gets killed has a knock-on effect on Alex wherever he's gone to, because he gets arrested and blamed for Megan's murder and possibly the murders of the other characters who died in the first movie. And he goes a bit bonkers at this point and starts raving about demonic puppets and stuff, and he's not believed and thrown into a lunatic asylum apparently, which, if you've seen the first movie, is not entirely believable because Alex seemed like quite a calm character. If I had to picture how he would react to being arrested for Megan's murder, I sort of think that he would just stay calm and get a solicitor personally. But anyway, he starts raving about the puppets, and there's sort of a contradiction at this point because, yes, obviously he would be treated with complete ridicule for trying to blame murders on puppets, but at the same time, the American government clearly believe him to an extent. How they got involved in the case in the first place, I don't know, but they send a team of paranormal investigators to the Boyega Hotel to at least investigate some of Alex's strange claims, and I'd never known a government in any country to do this. I mean, why would you spend money just on the ravings of somebody in a lunatic asylum? It's a little bit odd, but that's the setup of the movie. These new parapsychologists turn up at the Boyega Hotel and off we go again. I guess I've got to give the scriptwriters a little bit of credit for at least trying to stay true to the spirit of the first movie and getting a bunch of characters who were of sort of a similar profession, a similar age. If you'd have asked me to pen this film, the first thing I probably would have thought to do was just get a bunch of teenagers in a camper van, have them turn up, and one of them would knock on the door and then, oh, well, my granddad said this was a cool hotel to come and stay in back in the day, but it seems to be abandoned now. I guess we could break in anyway. Yeah, maybe it's good that I didn't write the film, but they've certainly had to come up with some narrative gymnastics to do what they've done instead. But you know what? Once the film starts, it doesn't matter. We have a bunch of paranormal investigators. They set up their equipment and off we go. There will be big conflict between these guys and the puppets. And of course, death and mayhem will follow. Once we do get going, though, it took me a while to warm to Puppetmaster 2. And the biggest reason for that is that I'm not really into a lot of the characters that we get here. They just don't seem that interested in what they're doing when they turn up at the hotel. Very clearly civil servants, but they look bored. And if they can't be bothered, why should I? I mean, they're setting up their equipment and they're saying things like, oh, let's just get this over and done with, as if they've gone on several of these sorts of trips and never seen anything remotely paranormal. I wonder if possibly these characters should have been from the private sector, and then they would have had more enthusiasm. They would have been more into ghosts and stuff. A bit like those characters, or people I should say, that you see on shows like Most Haunted and Ghost Hunters. Though I guess shows like that wouldn't have been around back in 1990, so the scriptwriters possibly wouldn't have thought of it. But certainly, when I think of this team of 4 people, there's only one of them that I like, and that's Carolyn, played by Elizabeth McClellan, the main girl. She seems to be taking the whole thing seriously, but the other 3, I'm just not interested in those characters. So for the first 20-25 minutes, I was kind of treading water a little bit in terms of my interest in the movie. But then things really kick into gear after a point. Several great things happen around about the same time. Firstly, a new character turns up called Michael, the film's second really good character. He strikes up a friendship with Carolyn, and it sort of develops into a romance as the film progresses. And I was really rooting for these two, and they do eventually get together. Also, another character turns up, a villain this time, Toulon himself. Now, we get a prologue in this film where we see the puppets resurrecting Toulon from a grave out back somewhere, but by the time Toulon actually turns up in the movie, I'd completely forgotten about the prologue. So it was a real surprise to me to see him suddenly walk in the door with bandages on and leather gloves and stuff, as if he's dressed himself up like the Invisible Man. It's not the same actor who played Toulon in the first movie. Clearly the filmmakers were completely allergic in terms of bringing back the same actors from that film. But I don't think they needed William Hickey, I think that was his name, because the role of Toulon this time is completely behind the bandages. All you need is somebody with a good voice, really, and the voice of the guy that they got, I mean, it's so syrupy and evil. It sounds something like this. At one point he says, "Clearly, Michael, his heart burns brightly for Carolyn. Torch, see that he gets an appropriately fiery demise." It says something like that. It's just beautiful. It sort of reminds me of the voice of Bane from The Dark Knight Rises. Perhaps he's wondering why you would shoot a man before throwing him out of an aeroplane. Yeah, it's sort of similar to that, I think. I've not listened to the two voices back to back, if you see what I mean. Another good thing about Toulon is that whenever he's in a scene with the protagonists, he's not just putting on a really fake, friendly persona. He is being polite, but there's also an antagonistic sort of edge to him at the same time, which just makes all the dialogue in these scenes really fascinating to follow. And the ending that we get with him is much better than the ending that we got with the villain from the first movie, where I thought the monologuing went on a bit too long. The puppet seemed to take forever to kill that guy. This time around, not only do we get a wonderful moment where Toulon puts himself into another body, this incredibly cool waxwork model thing, but also he keeps his chit-chatting to a minimum, and the puppets dispense with him much quicker when the time comes for them to turn on him. You know, they cut his hand off, push him out of a window, he's on fire as well. It's great stuff. Even though the film takes place in the same location as the first one, I still feel like the world has expanded a little bit. So we get scenes in the graveyard out back. This graveyard did not feature in the first film. There are also instances where the characters go for walks along the beachhead. Again, not something that the characters from the first film did. And we also get a couple of scenes at random farmhouse, about half a mile or so from the hotel. There's an angry farmer woman who sort of reminds me of Ethel from Friday the 13th Part 5. And according to her, the puppets have been leaving the hotel to terrorise her and her husband on their little homestead. Now, as a little side note, I kind of feel like the death of this farmer woman might have made for a better prologue than being placed halfway through the film, but I guess it's not that important. But this scene where Torch lights up this woman, this is one of the few parts of the movie that I remembered from when I watched it back in the 90s. I mean, how can you forget that? It's such a glorious moment, because you don't know what Torch is capable of when he sort of stands in front of this woman. So when the flames come out and you're seeing this for the first time, it's like, whoa! And it's proper stunt work. I mean, they've got an actual stunt woman on fire, and it's absolutely glorious. Brilliant old school filmmaking. The scene as a whole involving this farmer woman goes on for longer than I remembered. I only remembered the bit where she dies. I didn't remember the big battle leading up to that point, but it's all good. And we get the first death of a puppet in the series at this point, which again took me by surprise, because I certainly wasn't expecting Leech Woman to get burned in this little furnace thing. But I think it's good that sometimes puppets die during the movie. It just keeps you on your toes. I don't think the puppets should be completely invincible throughout the film. I mean, they're only puppets. I mean, sure, they can get the drop on the characters and kill them, but it should also work the other way. Because these puppets are so small, it absolutely stands to reason that sometimes the tables will be turned and they will get taken out of play themselves. And it's not like you can't bring puppets back for future installments. I mean, at the time of doing this video, I don't know which puppets end up being in a lot of the sequels and which ones do not end up being in a lot of the sequels. But if you look at the history of horror franchises, they usually find it easy enough to even bring back human characters. So I can imagine it's even easier for puppets. I mean, look how many times Chucky comes back in the Child's Play films because of some bullshit reason or another. In the case of Leech Woman, if she comes back, I'm sure it's very easy for some new puppet master to just build her again, and then the same soul of Leech Woman can be put into that. I don't know. But later on in this film, we also get the death of the driller puppet. So 2 puppets get taken out during this film, and I liked that. I liked the fact that we get those little surprises throughout. Going back to Leech Woman, I watched this film just the other night, and the night after I watched the audio commentary, which is done, in this case, by Charles Band, who's like the mogul behind these films, and he explained that it actually wasn't the intention to kill off Leech Woman during this film. It was actually mandated by the studio who were putting the money in for it, because apparently somebody watched the first movie, and even though they liked it, they said to Charles Band, look, great movie, but you've got to kill off Leech Woman. She's absolutely disgusting. Seriously, get rid of her. So that was the reason for it. I don't agree with the principle behind it, but I think it was an accidental positive because, like I said, seeing her being killed by the farmer woman was an interesting little surprise at a point of the movie I didn't expect it. Another positive, this time definitely more deliberate on the filmmaker's part, is the soundtrack. We get that same creepy carnival tune that we had in the first movie, and it's really good. And I've also got to mention, before I forget, this really wacky scene involving a child who's only in one scene. He's just randomly in the woods near the hotel, and he's got this like G.I. Joe doll, and he puts it against a tree and then just starts whipping it as if he's pretending that he's some kind of Nazi soldier or something, punishing a prisoner of war. It's really weird. And then Torch suddenly appears and ends up killing the boy. I can't imagine you would get a scene like this in a modern day horror film. I mean, at the time I'm doing this video, Scream 5 has just recently come out. I cannot imagine getting a random scene like this in Scream 5. You know, a kid with clearly possibly some mental health issues just whacking his G.I. Joe doll with a whip, and then Ghostface comes out of the bushes, kills him, and then moves on. I like the fact that we get a scene like this. It's just so random and off the wall. And I've got 2 more positives before I wrap up. So firstly, we get a very interesting denouement at the end of this, where it turns out that the puppets have nominated Camille, a character who dies more or less at the start of the movie, to be their new puppet master. They use the same gooey formula to resurrect her that they did for Toulon initially. So Camille takes the puppets on some kind of road trip, and it's sort of teased that the next movie will take place somewhere else. Now, as much as I like the Boyega Hotel as a location, I must admit I do like the idea of going somewhere different next time. So that was an interesting way to finish. And also there's a flashback scene in the middle of this film which shows us a little bit of Toulon's backstory in Egypt when he first got hold of the magic spell that enabled him to start bringing puppets to life. So that was a nice expansion of his personal history, and it was cool just having a scene in Egypt. So I'll quickly show you the version of the film that I've got for this. I've got the Blu-ray done by 88 Films. It's got 1 or 2 features. It's got, like I said, the commentary done by Charles Band. I've got to be honest though, it's not the greatest commentary track. I mean, Charles Band is a great guy. We wouldn't have Puppetmaster films but for him, but he's not the best at doing commentaries. He does tend to just ramble, and it very rarely during this was he actually talking about the scenes on the screen. You know, when I'm watching a commentary, I do like the people doing them to at least, you know, stay in touch with the movie that we're supposed to be watching to a certain extent. But Charles Band spends more time talking about some other Puppetmaster film than he does about number 2 during this commentary. I think there's a sequel called Axis Rising. And I'm guessing that at the time he did this commentary, this film was just coming out, because he mentions this film, Axis Rising, a hell of a lot. But anyway, the most important thing is that the movie itself is good. If the commentary is also good on the Blu-ray disc, it's just a kind of bonus. Right, let's get to the bag of terror and find out what sort of score I'm going to give this movie. So we got 1, 2, 3, 4 bloody axes out of 5. An exceedingly good score. I did think of giving it 3.5 to begin with, just because I don't think the characters in this film are very good, apart from Michael and Carolyn, but that would have been half an act short of what I gave the first film, and I don't know, I didn't want to give it less than the first film. So in the end, I've gone for 4. This is quite an important film for me in terms of my childhood. I really do remember it. It's the only Puppetmaster film I watched when I was younger, and it is a little bit special for that reason, and revisiting it was a special experience for me. And I think this film has more variety than the first film. You know, we get the trip to the farmhouse, we get the scene in Egypt, we get 1 or 2 other things that the first film doesn't give us. Where the first film triumphs over the second film is in the characters. I mean, all the characters are really good in the first movie, where it's a bit more spotty second time around. So, talking right now, honestly, I'm not sure overall which is the better movie, number 1 or number 2. It's something I'll have to think about a little bit more if I go on to do a ranking of this franchise. But certainly, I still have enthusiasm to go on with another film. When I set out on this little journey, in my head, I only committed myself to 2 films, because I thought to myself, well, I at least want to go as far as the second one so that I can have that nostalgia trip. But now that I've reached the end of number 2, I'm absolutely enthusiastic about seeing number 3. So I'll be back to do a review of that very soon. Until next time, cheerio, bye-bye.